The year is 1945. The dust of the Third Reich has settled over Germany, a fine gray powder of defeat and ruin. In a small village in Bavaria, the schoolhouse is a skeleton of its former self, its roof open to the sky, its walls pockmarked by shrapnel, its playground silent. The children, their faces pale with hunger and their minds haunted by air raids, watch from a distance as a convoy of American jeeps and trucks rumbles into the town square. The adults gather their children close, their hearts tightening with a familiar dread. They remember the stories, the warnings of vengeful occupiers. They expect requisitions, arrests, perhaps a final, spiteful demolition of what little remains. But then, the soldiers dismount. They do not brandish their rifles. Instead, they unload saws, hammers, and stacks of fresh timber. An army engineer points to the shattered school and speaks a single impossible word to the mayor, translated by a weary interpreter. We'll start tomorrow. That night, the village was consumed by a nervous silence, broken only by whispered debates. The elders, their minds hardened by a decade of Nazi rhetoric, warned of a trap. They will make us pay for the materials, one muttered. Or they will use it as a barracks and turn us out, said another. The image of the stern, well-fed Americans and their powerful machines was seared into their minds, a vision of a conqueror's cold efficiency. The children, however, whispered of a different wonder. They had seen the lumber, smelled the fresh-cut pine. They dared to imagine the sound of a bell in the tower again, the feel of a desk under their hands. For them, the school was not just a building. It was the anchor of a normal world that had been utterly erased by bombings and fear. Their parents looked at them with a profound sorrow, fearing that this nascent hope would make the inevitable disappointment all the more crushing. At dawn, the sounds began. Not the percussive blast of explosives, but the steady, rhythmic pounding of hammers, the screech of a saw biting into wood, the shouts of American soldiers, not in anger but in coordination. The villagers watched from behind curtained windows as the GIs, having shed their combat jackets, worked in their undershirts, their breaths misting in the cool morning air. They moved with a purpose that was entirely alien to the wary Germans. There was no hesitation, no reluctance. They attacked the rubble with a vigor that seemed to belong to a world of abundance and certainty, a world these villagers had forgotten. A young mother named Liesel, whose husband was missing on the Eastern Front, held her daughter's hand tightly as they watched. The child looked up, her eyes wide. "Are they fixing it for us, Mutti?" she asked. Liesel could only nod, her throat too tight with a confused emotion to form words. For days, the work continued. A fragile, unspoken rhythm developed. The American soldiers worked, and the German villagers watched. Then, small gestures began to bridge the silence. An elderly German carpenter, Herr Schmidt, who had lost his own workshop to a firebomb, appeared one morning with his toolbox. Without a word, he began sorting through the rubble, salvaging a usable hinge, a length of unbroken pipe. A young American lieutenant watched him for a moment, then nodded and pointed to a broken doorframe. It was not a command, but an invitation. Soon, other village men, their pride worn thin by necessity, joined in. They did not speak the same language, but they shared the universal language of craft, a pointed finger, a supporting hand, the shared effort of lifting a heavy beam. A bottle of water was passed between them. A pack of American cigarettes was offered and accepted with a silent, grateful nod. As the walls rose and the new roof took shape, the process became more emotional, more intimate. The soldiers were no longer just working on a structure, they were handling the ghosts of the village's past. They swept away shattered slates that had once borne the chalked lessons of children now dead or displaced. They uncovered a child's charcoal drawing, still clinging to a fragment of wall, depicting a stick-figure family under a smiling Sunday. The GIs, many of whom were fathers and brothers back home, grew quieter. The work became less a military task and more a solemn duty. They began to see the village not as a nest of Nazis, but as a community of survivors, of mothers and children and old men, all broken by the same cataclysm. The abstract concept of the enemy was crumbling, replaced by the tangible, human reality of a little girl's lost drawing. The final act was the hoisting of the new school bell, a gift procured from a nearby city by the American battalion commander. The entire village gathered in the square, their earlier suspicion replaced by a breathless anticipation. As soldiers and villagers together pulled on the ropes, lifting the gleaming brass bell into the resurrected tower, a profound silence fell. Then, the American engineer nodded to the village mayor. The old man, his hands trembling, took the rope and gave it a firm pull. A clear, resonant tone rang out over the village, a sound they had not heard in years. It was not the sound of air raid sirens or artillery, but the sound of peace, the sound of a future. It was in that moment that the weeping began. It was not the weeping of grief, but of a catharsis so deep it could find no other expression. Strong men wiped their eyes with their sleeves. Mothers held their children and cried openly. The weight of years of fear, loss, and indoctrination seemed to lift with that single, pure note. The next morning, the children lined up outside the new school, their hair combed, their worn clothes as clean as their mothers could make them. They carried satchels containing precious scraps of paper and stubs of pencils. The American soldiers stood to the side, forming an informal honor guard. They looked on their faces, a mixture of pride and a strange, wistful sadness. As the children filed in, they saw that on the new, smooth chalkboard, a single phrase had been written in careful, if clumsy, German. It was written by a GI who had asked the interpreter for the right words, für die Zukunft, for the future. The children took their seats at the new desks, the smell of fresh paint and pine wood filling the air. The war was over in the treaty halls, but in this classroom, peace had been built, nail by nail, by the hands of those who were supposed to be enemies. The story of that Bavarian village did not appear in grand histories. It was a quiet victory, one of thousands of small acts of reconciliation that paved the way for a lasting peace. The children who sat in those desks that day grew up with a memory that contradicted the hatred of their early years. They remembered the Americans not as conquerors, but as builders. The schoolhouse stood as a permanent, physical rebuttal to the ideology of eternal conflict. It proved that the most durable occupation is not one of subjugation, but one of construction. That the most powerful weapon against hatred is not a bigger bomb, but a simple act of restoring a child's place to learn. The GIs moved on, their mission completed, but they left behind more than a building. They left a lesson in humanity, written not on paper, but in wood and stone, and etched into the memory of a generation. In the weeks that followed, the school became more than just a place of learning. It became the beating heart of the village's recovery. The trust forged over hammers and saws extended to other parts of life. American medics set up a temporary clinic in the town hall, treating ailments that had festered for years. Cans of beef, chocolate bars, and oranges from military rations found their way into the hands of children, their bright wrappers like scattered jewels against the gray backdrop of ruin. The initial, fearful silence was replaced by a hesitant hum of interaction, broken German, fragmented English, and the universal language of shared smiles. For the soldiers, many of whom had only known the German landscape through the crosshairs of a rifle, this was a strange and poignant peace. They were no longer fighting an abstract enemy. They were helping a specific old woman carry her firewood. They were laughing with a specific group of children trying to master a game of baseball. The war, in all its monstrous abstraction, had finally ended, and in its place was the complicated, messy, and profoundly human work of rebuilding. For the adults in the village, however, this kindness was a double-edged sword. As they watched their children thrive, a deep and unsettling question began to gnaw at them, one that will haunt many for the rest of their lives. They had sent their own sons and husbands off to war, believing in the righteousness of their cause, believing the enemy to be a barbarian. Now, those same barbarians were sharing their food and had rebuilt their school. The contrast was devastating. A woman named Liesel, whose husband had died in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, confessed in her diary the thought she could never speak aloud. Did my hands die for a lie? If these men are monsters, then why does my daughter now sleep with a full stomach in the village that is healing? The Americans' generosity became a silent, daily accusation against the regime that had demanded their total sacrifice. The most profound conflict was no longer between nations, but within their own souls, a struggle between the lifetime of indoctrination and the undeniable evidence of their own eyes. When the American battalion finally received its orders to move on, the departure was not a celebration for the villagers, but a somber farewell. There were no grand speeches, only quiet handshakes and nods of mutual respect. The children, who had grown accustomed to the soldiers' presence, waved until the last jeep disappeared around the bend in the road. The soldiers themselves carried a piece of that village with them, a memory of a different kind of duty, one that did not destroy but restored. They had come as warriors and left as craftsmen of peace, having learned that the true measure of strength is not just in the ability to defeat an enemy, but in the courage to help them back to their feet. The school remained a silent teacher for generations to come, its very existence, a permanent lesson in the power of compassion, to disarm the deepest seated hatreds and to build a foundation for peace that is stronger than any fortress. This story, like so many others from that time, reminds us that the end of war is more than just the cessation of gunfire. It is the beginning of a more profound struggle, the struggle to rebuild trust, to heal wounds, and to choose a path of empathy over the easy course of vengeance. The echoes of those hammers in the Bavarian village are a testament to the fact that, even in the aftermath of history's most destructive conflict, humanity could still be found not in grand declarations, but in the simple, powerful act of rebuilding a school. If this story of unexpected mercy and the quiet beginnings of peace has moved you, please help us preserve these vital echoes of the past. Like this video, subscribe to WW2 Archives, and share your own thoughts or family stories in the comments below. We would be honored to hear what part of this narrative resonated with you. Thank you for watching, and for helping us ensure that these forgotten lessons in humanity are never lost.